Good evening, and welcome back to Just About History. Tonight we are going somewhere that most history books skip over. Somewhere that was, for a brief and remarkable window of time, one of the most culturally alive places in all of medieval Europe. A land of poets and merchants, of warm winds and vineyards and open roads. A land where people asked difficult questions about God and power and suffering, and where those questions, centuries before the printing press, before the Reformation, before any of the great ruptures we associate with the modern world, were answered in ways that the most powerful institution on earth found completely unacceptable. Tonight we are going to the south of France, to a region the medieval world called Languedoc, to a time when the Catholic Church was not just a faith but an empire, and to a story that ends in fire. This is the entire story of the Cathar Genocide, the crusade that Europe launched against itself. Before we begin, if you are new here, welcome. Just About History is exactly what it sounds like. Long, slow, carefully told stories from the past, designed to carry you gently through the night. If you enjoy what we do here, take just a moment to like the video and subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means everything for keeping these stories alive and finding their way to the people who need them most. And before we go any further, I would love to know where you are tonight. Drop your location and your local time in the comments below. Whether you are listening at midnight in Manchester or 3 in the morning in Melbourne, or winding down on a quiet Sunday evening somewhere in the American Midwest, there is something quietly wonderful about knowing that people all across the world are settling in at the same moment, listening to the same story unfold. Now, get comfortable. Adjust your pillow. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. If you have a fan running or rain on the window, let that sound settle into the background. So let's begin. To understand what happened to the Cathars, you have to first understand the world they were born into. The world of medieval Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries was one in which a single institution touched almost every aspect of human life, from the moment you entered it to the moment you left. The Catholic Church. We use that word institution, and it feels too cold, too modern, too bureaucratic for what the Church actually was in this period. It was not simply a place you went on Sundays. It was not simply a set of beliefs you held privately in your heart. The Church was the architecture of reality itself. It defined what was true and what was false. It decided who could read and what they were allowed to read. It held the keys, or claimed to hold the keys, to eternal salvation, which meant that every king, every peasant, every merchant, every mother rocking a child to sleep in a stone farmhouse somewhere in rural France lived their entire life in relationship to its authority. To be excommunicated, cast out of the church, was not simply a spiritual punishment. It was a social death. Other Christians were forbidden from doing business with you, eating with you, sheltering you. Your children could not receive sacraments. Your body could not be buried in consecrated ground. In a world where community was survival, excommunication was a weapon of extraordinary cruelty, and the Church wielded it freely. And the Church, by the 12th century, had grown extraordinarily powerful, extraordinarily wealthy. And in the eyes of many thoughtful, sincere, spiritually serious people across Europe, extraordinarily corrupt. This is not a modern accusation read backward into history. It was the lived experience of people at the time. Priests who kept mistresses openly and charged fees for sacraments. Bishops who purchased their positions from secular lords and spent more time managing estates than tending souls. Abbots who lived in luxury that would have embarrassed minor nobility. The gap between what the Church preached, poverty, humility, service, the imitation of Christ, and what it actually practiced had become, by the 1100s, a wound that many people across Europe could no longer ignore. Reform movements had been rising for generations. The Gregorian reform of the 11th century had tried to clean the institution from within, reasserting papal authority over the appointment of bishops, cracking down on simony, the buying and selling of church offices, and trying to enforce clerical celibacy. It had achieved some things, but the deeper disease, the sense that the church as a whole had become too entangled with wealth and power to genuinely represent the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, had not gone away. If anything, by the 12th century it had deepened. And into that wound, in the south of France, a very different kind of Christianity had taken root. But before we meet the Cathars themselves, we need to spend a little time in the place where they flourished. Because Languedoc, the region of southern France stretching roughly from the Rhine River in the east to the foothills of the Pyrenees in the west, was not simply a geographic location, it was a civilization unto itself. And understanding what made it distinctive is essential to understanding why what happened there was not just a religious suppression, but a cultural annihilation. The name Languedoc comes from the language spoken there. In the north of France, people said ol for yes, which would eventually evolve into the French oui we know today. In the south, they said oc, so the north was the land of the Langue d'Oil, and the south was the land of the Languedoc. Two different languages, two different cultures, and in the 12th century, two very different worlds. The south was, by almost every measure of its time, more open, more cosmopolitan, more intellectually alive than the feudal kingdoms of the north. This was not simply a matter of geography, though the Mediterranean climate and the ancient Roman road networks that crisscrossed the region certainly helped. It was a matter of history. Languedoc had been shaped by centuries of contact with peoples and ideas that the more isolated north had barely encountered. Jews lived openly in the towns of the south, practiced their faith without the systematic persecution that was already becoming common elsewhere in Europe, and contributed to the region's intellectual and commercial life. Muslim traders and scholars, carrying the accumulated knowledge of the Islamic Golden Age, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, astronomy, moved through the ports and markets of the Mediterranean coast. Greek texts that had been lost to the Latin West for centuries circulated in Arabic translation through the trading networks that connected Languedoc to Spain and Sicily and the wider Mediterranean world. The result was a culture of remarkable sophistication. The towns of Languedoc, Toulouse, Carcassonne, Albi, Béziers, Narbonne were not the muddy, insular settlements you might picture when you imagine medieval Europe. They were bustling, prosperous, literate places. The nobility of the south, the counts and viscounts and lesser lords, were on the whole less rigidly hierarchical than their northern counterparts, more accustomed to negotiation, more comfortable with the idea that authority had limits, and out of this culture had come something remarkable: the troubadours. The troubadours were poet-musicians, wandering composers who wrote and performed in the Occitan language, the Languedoc, and whose work represented the first great flowering of vernacular literature in medieval Europe. Before the troubadours, serious literary and intellectual work was done in Latin, the language of the church and the educated elite. The troubadours wrote for everyone. They wrote about love, complex, idealized, often unrequited love, in ways that were radically new for their time. They wrote about honour and beauty and the obligations of the powerful toward the weak. They performed at the courts of the southern nobility, who competed to attract the most talented among them, and their influence spread across Europe, shaping everything from the Arthurian romances of northern France to the poetry of Dante in Italy. The troubadour culture was not incidental to the Cathar story. It was woven into the same social fabric. The values it expressed, a certain independence of thought, a respect for the individual conscience, a skepticism toward rigid authority, were values that made the south of France a place where an alternative Christianity could not just survive but thrive. And now, at last, we come to the Cathars. Who were they? Where did they come from? And what exactly did they believe that was so threatening to Rome? The first thing to understand about the Cathars is that they did not call themselves Cathars. That name was given to them by their enemies, possibly derived from the Greek word katharos, meaning pure, though even that etymology is disputed. They called themselves simply Christians, good Christians sometimes, or good men and good women, referring to their spiritual elite. The label Cathar was an outsider's label, and like most labels applied by enemies, it tells us more about the labellers than the labelled. The second thing to understand is that the Cathar faith did not simply appear out of nowhere in the fields of Languedoc. It had roots, deep roots that stretched east across the Mediterranean world, back through centuries of heterodox Christianity, to traditions that the early church had fought and suppressed and driven underground, but had never entirely extinguished. The most direct ancestor of Catharism was a movement called Bogomilism, which had emerged in Bulgaria in the 10th century and spread west through the Balkans and into northern Italy and eventually France. The Bogomils themselves drew on even older traditions, on Manichaeism, the ancient Persian religion of light and darkness that had once counted St. Augustine among its followers before his conversion, and on strands of Gnostic thought that had circulated in the early Christian world before being declared heretical by the emerging Orthodox Church. What all of these traditions shared, at their core, was a particular answer to what philosophers call the problem of evil. If God is all-powerful and all-good, why does the world contain so much suffering? Why is there disease and cruelty and death and injustice? The Orthodox Christian answer, worked out over centuries of theological debate, involved concepts like free will and the fall of Adam and the mysterious purposes of divine providence. It was an answer that many people found intellectually satisfying, but it was also an answer that required a great deal of trust in the goodness of a world that often appeared to offer very little evidence of it. The Cathar answer was more radical, and in its way more honest about the darkness. The Cathars were dualists. They believed that the material world, the physical universe of rocks and trees and bodies and blood and suffering and decay, had not been created by the true God at all. It had been created by a lesser, corrupt, or outright evil being. Some Cathar theologians called this being the demiurge, borrowing a term from Platonic philosophy. Others identified him with the God of the Old Testament, the wrathful, jealous deity who commanded armies and drowned worlds and seemed, on close reading, rather too comfortable with violence and vengeance to be the same being as the loving Father described by Jesus in the Gospels. The true God, in Cathar theology, was pure spirit, perfect, transcendent, entirely beyond the reach of the material world. This God had created souls, spiritual beings of light, who had somehow become trapped in the corrupt material creation, imprisoned in physical bodies, forced to cycle through life after life in a world of suffering that was not their true home. The goal of human existence for the Cathars was to escape this prison, to purify the soul through right living and right belief until it could finally return to the realm of pure spirit from which it had originally come. This theology had profound practical implications. If the material world was corrupt or evil, then the things of the material world, wealth, physical pleasure, the reproduction of new bodies to trap new souls, were to be avoided, or at least approached with great caution. The Cathar spiritual elite, the people called the perfecti, the perfect ones, took this seriously. They lived lives of extraordinary austerity. They owned almost nothing. They ate no meat, no eggs, no cheese, no animal products of any kind, because such foods came from creatures that reproduced sexually and were thus more deeply entangled in the material world. They did not marry, they did not have sexual relations, they fasted regularly and severely, they travelled on foot from village to village, preaching and caring for the sick and the poor, dependent entirely on the hospitality of the communities they served. They also refused, on principle, to swear oaths. This sounds like a small thing, but in the medieval world it was enormous. The entire feudal system, the web of loyalty and obligation that held medieval society together, ran on sworn oaths. Lords swore fealty to higher lords, vassals swore service to their masters. Courts of law depended on witnesses swearing before God to tell the truth. The Cathar refusal to swear oaths was not simply a theological position. It was a quiet, persistent challenge to the foundations of the social order. And the perfecti did not charge for their spiritual services. They did not demand tithes. They did not sell sacraments. They healed the sick and comforted the dying and preached in the vernacular language that ordinary people could actually understand, not in the Latin that locked most of the population out of direct engagement with Scripture. And they asked for nothing in return except food and shelter and the willingness to listen. In a world where the official clergy was widely perceived as corrupt, self-serving, and more interested in its own wealth and power than in the souls of ordinary people, this was electrifying. The ordinary Cathar believers, called credentes, or believers, were not held to the same severe standards as the perfecti. They could marry, eat meat, own property, conduct normal lives. Their primary obligation was to respect and support the perfecti, to receive their blessing, and to commit, at some point before death, to receiving the central Cathar sacrament, the consolamentum. The consolamentum was the only sacrament the Cathars recognised. It was a laying on of hands administered by a perfectus, through which the believer was received into the ranks of the spiritually pure and their soul set on the path to final liberation from the material world. Most ordinary believers received the consolamentum only on their deathbeds, which allowed them to live relatively normal lives and then die in a state of spiritual grace. Some who received it while still healthy and recovered from whatever illness had prompted it faced a difficult choice. Either maintain the full austere lifestyle of the perfecti from that point forward, or undergo a spiritual fall and potentially need to receive it again later. The flexibility of this system and the genuine spiritual seriousness of the perfecti who administered it made Catharism remarkably adaptable to ordinary life. You did not have to overturn your entire existence to participate in it. You could raise children, run a farm, conduct trade, live a recognisably normal medieval life, and still feel that you belonged to a spiritual community whose leaders genuinely practiced what they preached. This was the key to Catharism's appeal. Not its theology, exotic as that theology was, but the visible, daily, undeniable contrast between the lives of the perfecti and the lives of the Catholic clergy. When a Cathar perfect walked into your village on foot, wearing a simple black robe, asking for nothing, healing your sick neighbours and comforting your dying grandmother, and explaining the mysteries of the faith in a language you actually spoke, and when the local Catholic priest was rumoured to have 3 children by a woman he could not officially acknowledge and had recently raised the fee for. Last rites, the comparison was not subtle. By the mid-12th century, Catharism had become not a fringe movement, but a mass phenomenon in Languedoc. Entire towns and villages had significant Cathar populations. Noble families sheltered and protected perfecti on their estates. The Count of Toulouse, the most powerful lord in the south, ruler of a domain that stretched across much of modern southern France, was surrounded by Cathar sympathisers and was himself, depending on the moment and the political winds, alternately sympathetic to the movement and willing to negotiate with Rome about suppressing it. Cathar communities had their own bishops, organised into dioceses that mirrored the structure of the Catholic Church. There were Cathar councils, Cathar theological debates, Cathar texts, in Occitan, in a language ordinary people could read. The movement had developed over the course of a century from a scattered collection of wandering preachers into something that looked disturbingly like an alternative church. And Rome was watching. The response of the papacy to the growth of Catharism in Languedoc had, up to this point, been largely a matter of attempted persuasion. Councils had been convened, letters had been written, papal legates had been dispatched to the south to preach against the heresy and win back the wandering sheep. In 1203, Pope Innocent III, one of the most able and ambitious popes of the entire medieval period, a man who genuinely believed in the universal authority of the papacy over all of Christendom and intended to exercise it, sent a new team of legates to the south with instructions to be more vigorous, more confrontational, more effective than their predecessors. Among the men who joined this preaching mission was a Spanish priest named Domingo de Guzman. We know him today as Saint Dominic, founder of the Dominican order, and his experience in Languedoc would shape the rest of his life. The story goes, and it is probably true in its essentials, if not in every detail, that Dominic and his companions arrived in the south and quickly realised why the previous missions had failed. The papal legates were travelling in style. They rode horses, stayed in comfortable accommodations, travelled with servants and retinues that made them look exactly like the wealthy, comfortable churchmen that the Cathars contrasted themselves against. The perfecti were walking barefoot through the villages. The papal representatives were processing through the towns on horseback. The contrast could not have been more damaging. Dominic's response was to abandon the horses, the servants, the comfortable lodgings. He walked. He debated Cathar theologians in public in the vernacular language, in front of crowds who could follow the argument. He embraced poverty and austerity and tried to meet the perfecti on their own spiritual ground. It was an admirable response. It was also, ultimately, a failure. Dominic was a genuinely holy man arguing for an institution that, in the eyes of many of the people he was trying to reach, had lost the right to be taken seriously. You could not preach your way out of a credibility crisis that deep. The Cathar faith was not spreading because of clever theology. It was spreading because people could see, with their own eyes, that the perfecti lived the way Christians were supposed to live. And so the preaching missions failed. And the church was running out of patience. The situation reached its breaking point in January of 1208. The papal legate to Languedoc, a man named Pierre de Castelnau, a Cistercian monk who had been working in the south for several years and had grown increasingly frustrated and increasingly harsh in his dealings with the local nobility, had a final bitter meeting with Count Raymond VI of Toulouse. The details of what exactly was said at that meeting are not entirely clear. What is clear is that it ended badly. Raymond, who had spent years trying to navigate between the demands of Rome and the realities of his own territory, where Cathars were everywhere and burning them, would mean burning his own subjects, his own vassals, possibly members of his own family. Raymond lost his temper. There were threats. There were accusations. The exact words are lost, but the tone is not. The next morning, January 14th, 1208, Pierre de Castelnau was crossing the Rainy River to begin his journey back north. One of Raymond's knights, whether acting on Raymond's orders or on his own violent initiative, a question historians have argued about for 8 centuries, rode up and drove a lance through the legate's back. Pierre de Castelnau died the following morning. and the history of southern France would never be the same. The news reached Rome within weeks, and Pope Innocent III's response was immediate, furious, and world-changing. He wrote to the kings and lords of northern France. He called upon them to take up arms, not against the Saracens in the Holy Land, not against the enemies of Christendom on the frontiers of Europe, but against their own neighbours, against the people of the south, against the heretics of Languedoc and the lords who harboured and protected them. He offered them everything the Church could offer: plenary indulgence, the complete remission of all sins for anyone who took up the cross against the Cathars. He offered them the lands of those they conquered, a powerful incentive for northern lords who had younger sons to provide for and limited territory to give them. He offered the promise of divine favour and eternal reward. What he was offering, in other words, was a crusade, but not a crusade to the distant shores of the Holy Land. A crusade right here, in the heart of Christian Europe. A crusade of Christians against Christians, of the North against the South, of an institution fighting for its survival against a people who had, however quietly, however peacefully, however gradually, built a world in which that institution was no longer necessary. The armies were already beginning to gather. And in the warm vine-covered hills of Languedoc, where the troubadours still sang and the perfecti still walked their barefoot rounds from village to village, the summer of 1209 was approaching like a storm on the horizon that everyone could see, and no one knew how to stop. The south of France in the early 13th century was not a place that looked like it was about to be destroyed. If you had walked through the streets of Toulouse in the spring of 1208, after the murder of Pierre de Castelnau, after Innocent III had sent his furious letters north, but before the armies had begun to move, you would have found a city going about its business with the particular confidence of a place that has been prosperous and culturally alive for a very long time. The markets were busy. The workshops of craftsmen and dyers and tanners filled the air with the sounds and smells of productive industry. Merchants from as far away as Italy and Spain moved through the streets. In the evenings, in the great halls of the nobility, troubadours performed their elaborate compositions to audiences who understood and appreciated every nuance of the form. And if you had known where to look, and in Toulouse in 1208, you would not have had to look very hard, you would have found them. The good men and good women. The perfecti, moving quietly through the city in their plain dark robes, welcomed into houses, fed at tables, listened to with a seriousness and a reverence that the local Catholic clergy had long since stopped receiving as a matter of course. Catharism, by the opening years of the 13th century, was not a secret. It was not a whispered underground movement conducted in cellars and back rooms by frightened people who knew they were doing something dangerous. It was, in Languedoc, something closer to the religious mainstream, or at least one of two competing mainstreams, the official Catholic one and the Cathar one, existing side by side with a degree of tolerance that would have seemed shocking and probably scandalous to anyone arriving from the north. This is one of the things that made what was coming so catastrophic. The people of the south were not bracing for an attack. They were living their lives. They were raising their children and tending their fields and conducting their commerce and listening to their poets and attending to their spiritual lives in whatever way seemed most genuine and most meaningful to them. The idea that a Christian army, an army raised by the Pope, bearing the cross, marching under the same banner that had been carried to Jerusalem, was coming south to kill them, was not something that fit easily into the mental landscape of the world they inhabited. But before the armies arrive, and they will arrive, and when they do, we will follow every step of the catastrophe they brought with them. We need to go deeper. We need to sit with the Cathars themselves for a while longer. We need to understand not just what they believed in broad outline, but how those beliefs worked in practice, in daily life, in the complicated and very human texture of a living faith. Because the Church's terror of Catharism was not simply about theology. It was about something more fundamental, something that threatened not just the spiritual authority of Rome, but its entire reason for existing. Let us begin with the perfecti, because they are the heart of everything. To become a perfectus, one of the spiritually initiated, one of the good men or good women, was not a decision taken lightly or quickly. It was the culmination of a process that could take years, and it required a complete and permanent transformation of the way you lived. Not a transformation of private feeling or internal conviction, but of everything, of what you ate, how you travelled, what you owned, how you related to other human beings, and what you were willing to suffer for what you believed. The path began with a period of apprenticeship. Someone who wished to become a perfectus would attach themselves to an existing one, living alongside them, observing their practices, gradually taking on the dietary restrictions and the lifestyle disciplines that defined the perfect life. This period could last months or years. It was not a formal seminary in the institutional sense. There were no Cathar universities, no official curriculum, no examinations. It was something closer to the relationship between a master craftsman and an apprentice, or between a monk and his spiritual director, intimate, personal, formed through daily proximity and observation rather than through abstract instruction. The dietary restrictions were the most immediately visible aspect of perfect life, and they were severe. The perfecti ate no meat of any kind, not beef, not pork, not lamb, not poultry. They ate no eggs. They ate no cheese, no milk, no butter, no animal fats. The reasoning behind this was theological rather than ethical in the modern sense. It was not primarily about compassion for animals, though that may have been a secondary consideration for some. It was about the doctrine of metempsychosis, the transmigration of souls. The Cathars believed that souls, trapped in the material world, cycled through multiple incarnations. A human soul in its current life might have been an animal in a previous one. To eat an animal was potentially to consume the flesh of a being that housed a soul on its upward journey toward liberation. The perfecti would not risk that contamination. What they did eat was fish, and this seems inconsistent until you understand the reasoning. Medieval biology, drawing on ancient sources, believed that fish reproduced spontaneously from water rather than through sexual generation. Since sexual reproduction was one of the primary mechanisms by which souls were trapped in new material bodies, fish, not being born of sex, were considered spiritually safer food. By modern standards, this is obviously wrong as a matter of biology, but as an expression of a coherent internal logic, it makes perfect sense. The perfecti fasted frequently and severely, 3 days a week, on bread and water only. Additional extended fasts at particular times of the spiritual year. These were not the relatively mild fasts of Catholic practice, giving up meat on Fridays, abstaining from certain foods during Lent. These were genuine, prolonged periods of near starvation, undertaken voluntarily as part of an ongoing discipline of bodily mortification that had as its goal the gradual loosening of the soul's attachment to the material world. They slept little and simply, usually on hard surfaces, without the comforts that even moderately prosperous medieval people considered basic necessities. They owned almost nothing: a robe, a copy of the Gospel of John, which held a special place in Cathar theology as the most spiritually elevated of the 4 Gospels, and whatever small items were necessary for their wandering ministry. And they wandered. The perfecti did not stay in one place. They moved constantly through the communities of believers in Languedoc, walking from town to village to isolated farmstead. Always in pairs, this was an important rule. never travelling alone, always with a companion of the same sex who could serve as witness and support, preaching, teaching, administering the consolamentum to the dying, and simply being present in the communities that sustained them. This constant movement was partly practical. No single household could support a perfectus indefinitely without strain, and partly theological. The perfecti were not supposed to have a fixed home in the material world. They were souls in transit, beings whose true home was elsewhere, and their restless movement through the landscape was a kind of living embodiment of that theological truth. The consolamentum, the single sacrament of the Cathar faith, deserves careful attention because it was absolutely central to everything. It was the mechanism by which the Cathar spiritual system worked, the hinge on which the relationship between perfecti and ordinary believers turned. And ultimately, one of the things that made the Cathar faith so difficult for the Inquisition to eradicate, even after the military crusade had destroyed the political infrastructure that supported it. The word itself means, roughly, the comforting or the consoling, and this is significant. The Catholic sacraments, however spiritually important, carried with them a strong element of institutional authority. The priest who administered them derived his power to do so from his ordination, which derived from apostolic succession, which derived ultimately from Christ's commission to Peter. The whole system was hierarchical, institutional, dependent on a chain of legitimate transmission that ran through the Church as an organisation. The consolamentum worked differently. A perfectus administered it, yes, but the power to administer it came not from institutional ordination, but from the spiritual state of the administering perfectus themselves. You had to be genuinely pure, genuinely living the perfect life to validly administer the sacrament. An immoral or corrupt perfectus, and the Cathars acknowledged this was theoretically possible, though rare, could not validly console anyone. The efficacy of the sacrament was tied to the actual spiritual condition of the person administering it, not to their institutional position. This was a radical departure from Catholic theology, which had spent centuries working out precisely the opposite argument, that the moral condition of the priest was irrelevant to the validity of the sacraments he administered. A corrupt priest could still validly baptize a child or consecrate the Eucharist, because the power came from the office, not the person. This was actually a compassionate and practically sensible position. It meant that believers did not have to worry about whether their priest was secretly sinful, but it also conveniently insulated the institution from the consequences of clerical corruption. The Cathar position, that spiritual authority, was personal, not institutional. That it had to be earned through actual practice rather than conferred through ordination was a direct challenge to this. And it meant that in a world where the actual behaviour of Catholic clergy was widely perceived as falling far short of Christian ideals, the Cathar position had an obvious and devastating appeal. The consolamentum ceremony itself was relatively simple. The candidate knelt before the administering perfectus. A gospel, usually John, was placed on their head. A formal exchange of prayers took place, including the Lord's Prayer, which the Cathars revered as the direct teaching of Christ. The perfectus laid their hands on the candidate's head, and sometimes other perfecti present would add their hands as well. There were prayers for the reception of the Holy Spirit. And then it was done. The candidate was received into the ranks of the perfecti, or, if they were a dying believer receiving it as a deathbed sacrament, their soul was set on the path of liberation. For the dying, the consolamentum was everything. It was the guarantee, or as close to a guarantee as Cathar theology offered, that the soul would not be reborn into the material world again, that this life, with all its suffering and confusion and loss, would be the last. But what came next would be the return to the realm of pure light from which the soul had originally fallen. You can perhaps understand, with this in mind, why ordinary people who suffered, who watched their children die of fever, who lost harvests to drought, who aged and ached and faced death with the particular terror that human beings have always brought to it, found this promise so compelling. The Catholic Church also promised heaven, but it promised it conditionally, hedged with purgatory and indulgences, and the perpetual anxiety of whether you had confessed enough, repented enough, given enough, been good enough. The Cathar promise, received through the consolamentum at the moment of death, was cleaner, more direct, more merciful in its way. The gender dynamics of Catharism deserve particular attention because they were, by the standards of the medieval world, extraordinary. Women could become perfectae, female perfecti, and did so in significant numbers. They administered the consolamentum. They preached. They taught. They ran houses of religious community where women gathered to live the perfect life together, engaging in weaving and other crafts to support themselves while maintaining their spiritual disciplines. These communities were scattered across Languedoc, in towns, in villages, on the estates of sympathetic nobles, and they were not hidden. They were known, accepted, integrated into the social fabric of southern communities. This was not normal. This was not anything close to normal in the context of medieval Christendom. The Catholic Church had, over the course of the 12th century, been systematically closing off the spaces in which women had exercised religious authority in earlier centuries. Female monasteries were increasingly brought under male supervision. Women were barred from preaching. The theological arguments for female spiritual inferiority, drawing on St. Paul's letters, on patristic tradition, on the association of women with Eve and the fall, and the dangerous powers of the flesh, had hardened into institutional practice. A woman could be a nun, could be a mystic in private, could be a saint after she was safely dead. She could not stand up in a public space and preach to a mixed congregation. Cathar Perfectae did exactly that. The theological basis for this equality was again rooted in the core dualist doctrine. If the material body was a prison for the soul rather than an essential part of the person, then the sex of the body was spiritually irrelevant. Your soul was not male or female. Your soul was a spark of divine light trapped in flesh, and the flesh's characteristics, its sex, its strength or weakness, its beauty or ugliness, were ultimately beside the point. A woman's soul was as capable of liberation as a man's. A woman's spiritual discipline was as valid as a man's. A woman's hands, if they were the hands of a true perfecter, were as capable of administering the consolamentum as any man's. This egalitarianism, radical, genuine, lived out in practice, rather than merely proclaimed in theory, was part of what made Catharism so threatening to Rome. Not just because it undermined the institutional hierarchy of the Church, but because it offered an alternative model of religious life that was visibly, demonstrably better at including and honouring people whom the official Church had decided did not really count. There was another dimension to Catharism that made the Church deeply uncomfortable, and it had to do with violence. The Perfecti, as part of their rejection of the material world and its values, refused to kill. They would not take human life under any circumstances. This was not simply a preference or a general inclination toward peace. It was an absolute principle derived from the theological conviction that the soul inhabiting any body, however wicked that body's actions might be, was a spark of divine light that had no business being extinguished by human hands. This created some interesting social and political complications. The Cathar believers, the ordinary faithful who had not taken the consolamentum and were not living the perfect life, were not held to this standard. They could be soldiers, could serve their lords in war, could do all the things that normal medieval men were expected to do. And many of them did. The military aristocracy of Languedoc contained plenty of Cathar sympathisers who had no difficulty reconciling their faith with the profession of arms. But the perfecti would not kill, would not swear oaths, would not participate in the structures of coercion and violence on which medieval society ultimately rested. And the Church, an institution that by the 13th century had developed sophisticated theologies justifying warfare, had launched multiple crusades to the Holy Land, had no difficulty with the idea of Christian armies killing in God's name, found this pacifism not admirable, but threatening. Because a religion that told its spiritual elite they must not kill was, implicitly, a religion that said killing was wrong. And that was a problem for an institution that had spent considerable intellectual energy arguing that it was sometimes right. Beyond the perfecti and the believers, the Cathar world had a structural dimension that Rome found alarming for reasons that were as much political as theological. By the mid-12th century, Catharism in Languedoc had organised itself into a genuine church. Not a church in the shadow sense of a secret society or an underground network, but a church with bishops, with defined territories, with councils that met to resolve theological disputes and administrative questions. There were 4 main Cathar dioceses in southern France: Toulouse, Albi, Carcassonne, and the Raz, along with communities in northern Italy and scattered across other parts of Europe. Each diocese had a bishop and 2 successors, designated in advance so that the line of spiritual authority could continue unbroken even if the current bishop died or was captured. There were formal gatherings of perfecti, councils at which doctrine was discussed and refined, at which the boundaries between dioceses were negotiated, at which the shared concerns of the Cathar community were addressed collectively. This organisational sophistication was itself a kind of provocation. A handful of wandering preachers with exotic beliefs was a nuisance. A structured, geographically distributed institution with its own hierarchy, its own sacramental system, its own communities of dedicated religious, that was a rival. That was, in the eyes of Rome, not just a heresy to be corrected, but an alternative church to be destroyed. And in 1167, at a council held at St. Flix-de-Caraman in the county of Toulouse, the Cathars of southern France had done something that made their institutional ambitions unmistakable. They had hosted a gathering attended by Cathar leaders from across southern France and northern Italy, presided over by a visiting bishop from the east, a man called Nicitas or Nicinta, representing the Bogomil churches of the Byzantine world. At this council, the organisational structure of the Cathar Church in the West had been formalised, bishops had been consecrated, dioceses had been defined, and the connection between the Western Cathars and their Eastern spiritual ancestors had been publicly affirmed. Rome knew about this council. Rome understood exactly what it meant. The Cathars were not simply a collection of spiritually sincere individuals with unorthodox beliefs. They were a church. They had a hierarchy. They had a geographical presence. They had, in Languedoc especially, the protection and support of a significant portion of the secular nobility. And they were growing. The Catholic Church's initial response to all of this, before the Crusade, before the Inquisition, in the long decades when Rome still believed the problem could be solved through argument and persuasion, is instructive precisely because of how thoroughly it failed. A series of church councils in the 12th century had condemned Catharism in increasingly strong terms. The Third Lateran Council of 1179 had called for military action against Cathar communities in southern France. This was actually the first formal call for a crusade against the Cathars, though it produced nothing of practical consequence at the time. Letters, legates, preaching missions, All had been deployed. All had achieved very little. The reason they had achieved very little was the one that Dominic had identified during his time in the south. The missionaries sent to combat Catharism arrived representing an institution that had lost the moral authority to make its arguments convincing. You can deploy the most sophisticated theology in the world, you can send the most learned and genuinely holy men you can find. But if the institution they represent is visibly corrupt, if the contrast between its official teachings and its actual practices is a daily, visible, undeniable feature of the landscape, the theology will not land. There was also a practical political problem. The secular lords of Languedoc, the Count of Toulouse above all, but also the Viscount of Ziers and Carcassonne, and many lesser nobles, were not themselves necessarily devout Cathars, but they were not going to help Rome persecute their own subjects. Some of them had Cathar relatives, many of them had political relationships with Cathar communities that made persecution practically and personally costly, and some of them, frankly, resented the Church's interference in the affairs of their territories and found the presence of an alternative religious system that owed nothing to Rome a useful counterweight to papal influence. Raymond VI of Toulouse, the count who would shortly find himself at the centre of the catastrophe, was a complicated man in a complicated position. He had been married 4 times, which was already a source of tension with the Church. He had Cathar relatives. He had Cathar vassals. He had grown up in a world where Catharism was simply part of the religious landscape of the South, where the perfecti were respected community figures rather than dangerous heretics, where the question of whether someone was a good Catholic or a good Cathar was considerably less important than whether they were a good neighbour, a reliable ally, a fair lord. He was not a man equipped, temperamentally or politically, to lead a persecution of his own people on behalf of a distant pope. And his reluctance, his perpetual hedging, his promises made to Rome and then not kept, his endless negotiations and deferrals, had made him, in the eyes of the papacy, either a coward or a collaborator. Possibly both. And then Pierre de Castelnau was killed on the bank of the Rhine, and the room for negotiation closed. Pope Innocent III was not a man who responded to crisis with paralysis. He was perhaps the most formidable pope of the entire medieval period. A trained lawyer, a brilliant political operator, a man who had spent his pontificate systematically expanding the authority of the papacy over the secular rulers of Europe, and was not inclined to see that authority flouted or mocked. His letters in the aftermath of Castelnau's murder are worth dwelling on, because they reveal something important about how he understood what was happening in the south of France. He did not write about the Cathars primarily as lost souls who needed to be brought back to the truth. He wrote about them as a political and institutional threat. He wrote about the lords who protected them as men who had betrayed their obligations to the Christian order. He wrote about the need to use force, real, decisive, devastating force, to resolve a problem that gentler methods had failed to address. He wrote to Philip II of France, the king, urging him to take the lead in the Crusade. Philip, in the middle of his own wars with England and the Holy Roman Empire, declined, but he allowed his barons to go if they wished, and they did. He wrote to the nobility of northern France more broadly, offering them the full range of crusade indulgences and the additional incentive of the lands they would conquer. He appointed a new papal legate, a Cistercian abbot named Arnaud Amalric, a man of considerably less patience and considerably more zeal than his predecessor, to lead the ecclesiastical side of the enterprise. And he wrote to Raymond of Toulouse, who in the weeks after the murder had tried desperately to distance himself from it, to argue that the knight who had killed Castelnau had acted without his orders, to negotiate, to promise reform, to do anything that might avert the catastrophe he could see gathering on the northern horizon. Innocent's response to Raymond's overtures was not entirely closed. He was willing to offer the Count a path back to legitimacy, but the price was humiliation. Raymond had to submit to a public penance. He had to be scourged at the doors of the church where Castelnau was buried. He had to take the cross himself to join the crusade against his own subjects. He had to hand over 7 of his castles as security for his good behaviour. Raymond, in the summer of 1209, accepted these terms. He knelt, he was beaten, he took the cross, he surrendered the castles. He did all of it, because the alternative was to see himself declared an enemy of the church, his lands forfeit, himself excommunicated, and he calculated that submission, however humiliating, was survivable in a way that open defiance might not be. And then he watched the army come south. The army that gathered in the summer of 1209 was one of the largest military forces assembled in Western Europe in the 13th century. Estimates vary, medieval chroniclers were not reliable with numbers, and the incentive to exaggerate in both directions was strong. But it was almost certainly tens of thousands of men. Knights from Burgundy and the Lead of France and Champagne and the Rhine Valley, infantry from a dozen regions, hangers-on and servants and camp followers and priests, all converging on the town of Lyon in the late spring of 1209, and then marching south through the Rhône Valley toward the warm lands of Languedoc. Many of them had come for the indulgence, the guarantee of spiritual reward. Many had come for the land and the plunder that a successful crusade in a wealthy region would make available. Some had come out of genuine religious conviction, a sincere belief that the Cathars were dangerous heretics whose presence threatened the salvation of everyone around them. The mixture of motives was, as it always is in such enterprises, complicated and not entirely separable. What was not complicated was the papal legate Arnaud de Malric's understanding of his mission. He had been sent south to destroy heresy. He intended to do so. He was not a man inclined toward half measures or excessive concern for the distinction between the guilty and the innocent. And it was Arnaud de Malric who, at the first great atrocity of the Crusade, would speak words that have echoed down 8 centuries of history as perhaps the most chilling expression of religious violence ever attributed to a Christian leader. But that is a story for the next part of tonight's journey. For now, the army is marching, the banners are flying, the crosses are bright in the summer sun of southern France, and in the towns and villages of Languedoc, people are beginning to understand, truly understand, in the way that you understand things when the ground begins to shake beneath your feet. But what is coming is not a negotiation. It is not a mission. It is not another round of preaching and debate and councils and letters. What is coming is something the south of France has not seen in living memory. Something that the warm, cosmopolitan, culturally alive civilization of Languedoc, with its troubadours and its merchants and its remarkable experiment in religious coexistence, has no real framework for comprehending. What is coming is war. Total, sanctified, and merciless war, and the first town to learn this lesson will learn it in a way so absolute, so devastating, so completely without precedent in the religious history of medieval Christendom, that the news of it will travel across Europe in weeks and leave people, even people who supported the Crusade, even people who believed the Cathars were dangerous heretics, struggling to find words for what had been done in the name of God. The army is almost at the gates, and the gates of Béziers are about to open. Béziers was not a city expecting to die. It was a prosperous, medium-sized town in the lowlands of Languedoc, situated on a rocky hill above the river Aube, surrounded by vineyards and orchards and the quiet agricultural landscape of the Mediterranean south. It had a cathedral. It had markets. It had a mixed population of Catholics and Cathars who had been living alongside each other for generations, with the particular ease of people who have decided, however implicitly, that the question of which version of Christianity you follow is less important than the practical business of being neighbours. The Viscount of Bziers and Carcassonne, a young man named Raymond Roger Trencavel, barely 24 years old in the summer of 1209, had ridden south ahead of the crusading army in a desperate attempt to organise the defence of his territories. He had gone first to Montpellier, where the papal legate Arnaud Amalric was meeting with the crusade leadership, and had tried to negotiate. He had offered submission. He had offered to hand over named heretics. He had offered whatever concessions might persuade the legates to spare his lands and his people. He was turned away. There was nothing to negotiate. The crusade had not travelled hundreds of miles to be talked out of its purpose by a young viscount whose territory was, in Rome's view, a nest of heresy that needed to be cleaned out rather than accommodated. Raymond Roger rode back south and tried to prepare his cities for what was coming. He arranged for the Jewish population of the region, who had reason to fear crusading armies from bitter experience, to take refuge behind the walls of Carcassonne, where he intended to make his primary stand. He did what he could. He was 24 years old, his territory was scattered, his resources were limited, and the army moving toward him was one of the largest assembled in a generation. On the 21st of July 1209, the crusading army arrived before the walls of Bziers. What happened next unfolded with a speed that shocked even the people who caused it. The Catholic bishop of Bziers, a man named Renaud de Montperu, who had been tasked by the legates with presenting the town's leadership with a list of known Cathar heretics who should be surrendered to the Crusaders, went into the city and delivered his message. The list contained approximately 220 names. If the town handed over these individuals the bishop conveyed, the rest of the population would be spared. The town refused. The reasons for this refusal are not entirely clear in the historical record, but the most plausible explanation is also the most humanly understandable one. The people of Bziers, Catholic and Cathar alike, looked at that list of 220 names and saw their neighbours, their relatives, people they had grown up with, done business with, shared meals with, and they decided, collectively, that they were not going to hand them over to be burned. It was, in its way, a remarkable act of communal solidarity. It was also, as events would prove, a fatal one. The bishop left the city, and the crusading army settled in to begin what everyone expected would be a conventional siege, the slow, grinding business of surrounding the walls, cutting off supplies, building siege engines, waiting for hunger and thirst to do what direct assault could not. But sieges take time, and what happened at Bziers did not take time at all. Among the army gathered outside the walls of Bziers were a large number of men who had attached themselves to the crusade not as knights but as camp followers, men called ribauds in the contemporary chronicles, the poorest and most desperate of the Crusade's followers, men who had joined the march south with no horses, no armour, no formal military role, hoping for whatever scraps of plunder and opportunity a crusade might provide. The exact sequence of events on the morning of July 22nd, 1209, is disputed in the sources and probably impossible to reconstruct with complete accuracy. What seems to have happened is this. A group of the town's defenders made some kind of sortie from the gates, came out, perhaps to taunt the besiegers, perhaps in a genuine if reckless military probe, and were driven back. In the chaos of that brief engagement, the ribauds surged forward. They forced their way through the gates before the defenders could close them. They poured into the city. And then the killing began. The ribauds were followed by the knights. The army that had come to conduct an orderly siege found itself inside the town, and the distinctions that a formal military operation might have maintained between combatants and civilians, between heretics and Catholics, between the guilty and the innocent, collapsed almost immediately in the violence and confusion of urban fighting. People ran for the churches. This was the traditional refuge in medieval warfare, the sanctuary of sacred space, the assumption that even the most brutal soldiers would not violate a house of God. The Cathedral of St. Nazaire filled with terrified townspeople, Catholic and Cathar alike, seeking protection behind its walls. It did not protect them. The cathedral was set on fire. The people inside burned with it. The chronicler who recorded the words of Arnaud Amalric in the aftermath of the massacre, a Cistercian monk named Caesarius of Heisterbach, writing some years later, gave the papal legate a line that has become perhaps the most infamous sentence associated with the entire crusade. When asked, according to this account, how the Crusaders should distinguish between the Catholic inhabitants and the heretics, Arnaud Amalric allegedly replied, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Historians debate whether Arnaud Amalric actually said these words, or whether Caesarius invented or embellished them in the retelling. The debate is real and legitimate. But two things are worth noting. First, Arnaud Amalric himself, writing to Pope Innocent III shortly after the massacre, reported that nearly 20,000 people had been killed at Bziers, without regard for rank, sex or age, and he reported this not with horror or regret, but with what reads unmistakably as satisfaction. He was proud of the thoroughness of the slaughter. Second, whether or not the precise words were spoken, the actions they describe were performed. The Catholics of Bziers died alongside the Cathars, the children died alongside the adults. The people who had sheltered in the cathedral died in the fire that consumed it. The words, real or invented, are memorable because they fit. They describe what happened. And what happened was not an accident or an excess or a regrettable loss of control. It was, as the subsequent conduct of the crusade would make clear, a statement of intent. The message of Bziers was simple. It was also perfectly clear to everyone in Languedoc who heard it, and they all heard it very quickly. There would be no distinction made between heretic and Catholic, between the guilty and the innocent, between those who had actively embraced Catharism and those who had merely declined to persecute their Cathar neighbours. The crusade had not come to sort the sheep from the goats. It had come to clear the field. The news from Bziers travelled south ahead of the army like a shockwave. Raymond Roger Trencavel, who had been trying to organise the defence of his territories, now faced a situation that had changed completely. The calculation that people in threatened cities might make, that resistance was dangerous, but surrender might be survivable, had been altered by Bziers. If surrender meant death anyway, if the Crusaders were going to kill everyone regardless of their faith, then what exactly was the incentive to open the gates? But the scale of the army and the memory of what had happened at Bziers also produced the opposite reaction in many places. As the Crusaders moved south and west from Bziers toward Carcassonne, town after town along the route opened its gates without resistance. The smaller settlements, villages, minor towns, places with no realistic prospect of mounting a successful defence, calculated that submission, however terrifying, was the only option. They sent delegations out to meet the army. They offered provisions. They opened their gates. What they received in return was not consistent. Some were treated with relative mercy, others were not. The logic of the Crusade's treatment of surrendering settlements seemed to depend partly on the judgment of individual commanders, partly on how much Cathar activity the town was perceived to harbour, and partly on factors that probably had more to do with the mood of the army on a particular day than with any coherent policy. This inconsistency was itself a form of terror. You could not calculate your way to safety. You could not be confident that surrender would protect you, but you could be fairly confident that resistance would not. So the towns opened their gates, and they waited, and they hoped. Carcassonne was different. Carcassonne was going to fight. The city of Carcassonne in 1209 was one of the most formidable fortified positions in southern France. Situated on a commanding hill above the river Aude, protected by massive walls that had been reinforced and improved over centuries, with a population swelled by the refugees who had fled there from the surrounding countryside, including the Jewish community Raymond Roger had brought inside for protection. It was a serious military challenge, even for a large and well-equipped army. The Crusaders arrived before Carcassonne in late July, only days after the massacre at Bziers. Raymond Roger Trencavel was inside the walls, organising the defence, directing the garrison, projecting the kind of confident determination that a young commander in an impossible situation can sometimes manage for a while. The siege began. The Crusaders attacked. The defenders held. For 2 weeks, the walls of Carcassonne did what walls are supposed to do. They kept the enemy out. But walls cannot solve every problem, and the problem that was killing Carcassonne from the inside was not military. It was water. The city's water supply, the wells inside the walls, the cisterns, the arrangements made in advance for surviving a siege, proved insufficient for the population that had crowded into the city. The summer of 1209 was hot. The refugees from the surrounding countryside had brought animals with them as well as people, and the animals needed water too. Disease began to spread in the crowded, increasingly unsanitary conditions inside the walls. The dead and dying began to accumulate faster than they could be dealt with. Raymond Roger, facing the prospect of his city dying of thirst and disease rather than falling to direct assault, agreed to negotiate. He was offered a safe conduct, a guarantee of personal safety, to come to the Crusader camp and discuss terms. He accepted. It was a trap. Or at least, it functioned as one. Raymond Roger Trencavel walked into the Crusader camp under safe conduct and did not walk out again. He was taken prisoner, held in his own citadel after the city surrendered, and died in captivity 3 months later. The official account said it was dysentery. Contemporary observers and subsequent historians have not always found this convincing. The population of Carcassonne was expelled. They were allowed to leave with their lives, this was notable given Bziers, but with nothing else. No possessions, no clothing beyond what they were wearing. The chronicles describe them leaving the city in their shirts, streaming out through the gates into the late summer heat, carrying nothing, going nowhere in particular. The city that had sheltered them was now in the hands of the Crusade, and they were on the road. The fall of Carcassonne was significant beyond its immediate military consequences. The Crusade now needed a commander, a secular military leader to hold and administer the conquered territories, since the great lords who had brought their feudal levies south had obligations at home and could not stay indefinitely. The 40-day minimum service that gave a crusader his full indulgence was satisfied. Many of the northern barons were already thinking about going home. The man chosen to fill this role, chosen by Arnaud Amalric and the other legates, with the agreement of the Crusade leadership, was a minor northern French lord named Simon de Montfort. And with Simon de Montfort, the character of the Crusade changed. Simon de Montfort the Elder, to distinguish him from his more famous son, who would later become the founder of the English Parliament, was not a man of whom history has produced a simple portrait. He was, by the accounts of those who admired him, a man of extraordinary personal courage, deep religious conviction, and formidable military ability. He was, by the accounts of those who suffered under him, one of the most brutal and relentless commanders of his age. Both accounts are probably accurate. They are not contradictory. He was in his mid-40s in 1209, an experienced soldier who had been on crusade before. He had participated in the Fourth Crusade 8 years earlier, and had been one of the commanders who had refused to participate in the diversion to Constantinople that turned that crusade into a scandal, choosing instead to go directly to the Holy Land. This decision had cost him the plunder that his fellow crusaders collected in Constantinople, and earned him a reputation for principled if inflexible religious commitment. He was offered the lordship of the conquered territories, the Trencavel viscountcy of Ziers and Carcassonne, and he accepted. And unlike the great lords who had led the Crusade's initial thrust, Simon de Montfort did not go home after 40 days. He stayed. He stayed for years. He made the war in the south his war, his life's work, his obsession. What followed, the years between 1209 and Simon's death in 1218, was one of the most brutal, sustained military campaigns in medieval European history. Not the largest, not the most dramatic in terms of individual battles, but in terms of the systematic, relentless, grinding destruction of a people and a culture, almost without parallel. The nature of the war in Languedoc was not the war of great pitched battles and decisive engagements that the chivalric literature of the period celebrated. It was a war of sieges and counter-sieges, of raids and counter-raids, of villages burned and populations expelled, of castle garrisons reduced by starvation and then massacred, of a landscape gradually methodically stripped of the political infrastructure, the castles, the towns, the networks of noble protection that had allowed Catharism to flourish. Simon de Montfort was extraordinarily good at this kind of war. He had a small but highly disciplined core force of knights who remained with him year-round, supplemented by the fresh waves of crusaders who arrived each spring to serve their 40 days and earn their indulgence. He moved fast, exploited divisions among the southern nobility, made alliances where he could, and applied overwhelming force where he couldn't, and maintained a ruthlessness that his enemies in the south found both terrifying and, in a way, clarifying. Because Simon did not pretend to be doing something other than what he was doing. He was not primarily interested in converting heretics. He was interested in destroying the political and social conditions that allowed heresy to exist. He wanted the nobles of the south to stop protecting Cathars. He wanted to demonstrate through examples of sufficient horror that the cost of protection was too high. He wanted to break the relationship between the Cathar community and the secular power that sheltered it, not by winning theological arguments, but by making shelter too dangerous to offer. This strategy required violence that was deliberate, exemplary, and public. It required not just defeating enemies, but destroying them in ways that other potential enemies could see and understand and draw conclusions from. In the spring of 1210, Simon moved against the castle of Bram, a fortified position that had been held by a garrison of crusade opponents. When Bram fell after a brief siege, Simon ordered a punishment that was designed not simply to punish the garrison, but to send a message to every other garrison in Languedoc. He had roughly 100 prisoners blinded. Their noses were cut off. Their upper lips were cut off. One man was left with one eye, just enough sight to lead the column, and this procession of mutilated men was sent to walk to the next castle that was holding out against the crusade, so that its garrison could see, literally see, what resistance cost. The cruelty of this act is almost impossible to contemplate. But it was not random cruelty. It was purposeful. It was a communication, delivered in the only language that Simon believed the situation required. He followed it with the siege and capture of the castle of Minerve, one of the key Cathar strongholds in the region. Minerve held out for several weeks before being forced to surrender by the familiar problem of water. A summer siege in the south of France was always ultimately a siege of water, not walls. When the castle fell, there was a question of what to do with the Cathar perfecti who had taken refuge there. The papal legate who was present, not Arnold Amalric on this occasion but another cleric, made what he clearly considered a generous offer. Any perfectus who was willing to recant, to formally renounce the Cathar faith and return to the Catholic Church, would be spared. It was, from Rome's perspective, an opportunity for mercy. Almost none of the perfecti took it. The chronicles record that 1 or 2 women were led out of the fire by other believers before they could be burned. The rest, approximately 140 perfecti, men and women, walked into the fire themselves. Not pushed. Not dragged. They walked. They sang. The contemporary Catholic chronicler who recorded this was clearly disturbed by it. He could not easily dismiss people who died like that as simply wrong. He noted, with what reads as genuine unease, that their courage in the face of death was remarkable. It was remarkable. It was also, in its way, another communication, delivered in the opposite direction from Simon's mutilated prisoners. The perfecti of Minerve were saying, with their deaths, that the faith they held was worth dying for, that the Crusade could burn their bodies but could not reach what they actually were. The war in Languedoc was not fought only in the towns and castles of the major settlements. It was also fought, and in some ways more devastatingly fought, in the countryside, in the hundreds of small villages and isolated farmsteads and minor noble estates that made up the everyday texture of life in the south. Here the Crusade operated at its most diffuse and its most destructive. Raiding parties moved through the agricultural land, burning crops and granaries, driving off livestock, destroying the infrastructure of rural life that fed the towns and sustained the population. This was standard medieval military practice, the chevauche, the mounted raid designed to devastate enemy territory. But in the context of the Albigensian Crusade it took on an additional dimension, because the destruction of the countryside also meant the destruction of the networks of support that the perfecti depended on. The perfecti, as we have seen, were wanderers. They moved through the communities of Languedoc, dependent on the hospitality of believers for food and shelter. If the villages were burned, if the farmers were killed or driven off, if the noble estates that had given the perfecti protection were seized by northern lords who had no interest in sheltering heretics, the perfecti would have nowhere to go. The physical destruction of the landscape was simultaneously a destruction of the social landscape that made Catharism viable. Simon de Montfort understood this connection. It was not accidental. The political situation in Languedoc during these years was extraordinarily complicated, and it is worth pausing to appreciate the complexity rather than reducing it to a simple story of northern aggression against southern innocence, though there was genuine aggression and genuine innocence in the mix. Raymond VI of Toulouse, the count who had submitted to public penance at the start of the Crusade and taken the cross himself, had managed, through his submission, to avoid having his own territories directly attacked in the first phase of the Crusade. He had spent the years since 1209 in an uncomfortable position, formally allied with the Crusade, watching his southern neighbours be destroyed, trying to navigate between his obligations to the papacy and his relationships with the people of his own region. By 1211, he had decided he could not maintain this position any longer. He broke with the Crusade. He returned to open resistance, and for the next several years the war in Languedoc became not just a crusade against heresy, but a war between Simon de Montfort and the Count of Toulouse, a war for the political control of the most powerful territory in the south. This shift complicated the Crusades' religious narrative considerably. Raymond was Catholic. He had always been Catholic. His quarrel with the papacy was political and jurisdictional rather than theological. He did not share the Cathar faith, even if he had declined to persecute his Cathar subjects. When the Crusade attacked his territories, it was attacking a Catholic count in the name of fighting heresy, which required a certain amount of theological creativity to justify, and which many contemporaries found difficult to accept. The papacy managed this difficulty by arguing that Raymond's protection of heretics made him effectively complicit in heresy, that a lord who refused to persecute Cathars was functionally as culpable as a Cathar himself. It was an argument that extended the logic of the Crusade from the suppression of a specific heresy to the punishment of anyone who failed to suppress it, which was a significant expansion with significant implications for what the Crusade was actually about. It was, at this point, less and less about souls and more about land. The siege of Toulouse in 1211 was Simon de Montfort's first major setback. The city was too large, too well defended, too determined to resist. The population of Toulouse, which included many Catholics who had no particular sympathy for Catharism, but a great deal of sympathy for their own city's independence, fought with a ferocity that surprised the Crusaders. The siege failed. Simon withdrew. But withdrawal was not retreat. Simon continued to methodically reduce the smaller positions surrounding Toulouse, strangling the city's connections to the wider world, building the military infrastructure for a campaign that might take years but would eventually succeed. He won a significant pitched battle at Muret in 1213 that changed the political landscape of the entire region. The Battle of Muret deserves particular attention because of who was killed there. Peter II of Aragon, the King of Aragon, one of the most powerful rulers in the Western Mediterranean, a man who had personally crusaded against the Muslims of Spain and was thus impeccably orthodox in his religious credentials, had intervened in the conflict on the side of the southern lords. Not because he supported Catharism, but because several of the southern nobles were his vassals and his relatives, and he had political and dynastic interests in preventing the northern French from taking over the south of France. His intervention had forced an awkward moment of political reckoning. If the Crusade killed the King of Aragon, a faithful Catholic Crusader king, to advance the political ambitions of a minor northern French lord, what exactly was it crusading for? The papacy had actually at one point issued instructions trying to negotiate a settlement that would spare Peter and the Catholic lords of the south. Simon had essentially ignored them. At Muret, Simon's cavalry, vastly outnumbered but fighting with extraordinary discipline and aggression, smashed the Aragonese army and killed Peter II in the fighting. It was a military masterpiece. It was also a political catastrophe for the Pope's ability to claim the Crusade was purely about religion. The King of Aragon was dead. His son, the future James I, was in Simon de Montfort's custody. The political map of southern France was being redrawn in blood, and the theological justification for the redrawn map was becoming harder and harder to maintain with a straight face. The years between Muret and Simon de Montfort's death in 1218 were years of grinding, exhausting, methodical conquest. Castle after castle fell. Settlement after settlement submitted or was destroyed. The old nobility of Languedoc, the counts and viscounts and lesser lords who had given the south its distinctive character, were killed, captured, exiled or reduced to vassalage under northern lords who owed their positions to Simon and through him to the Crusade and through the Crusade to Rome. The Cathar perfecti, deprived of their noble protectors, driven from the communities that had sustained them, increasingly found themselves in the high country, the mountains and the remote valleys at the edge of Languedoc, where the crusading army's reach was limited by terrain and logistics. Some fled to northern Italy, where Cathar communities still existed in relative safety. Some went underground, abandoning the visible, open practice of their ministry for a clandestine existence of secret meetings and hidden identities. Some were captured and burned. The culture that had produced the troubadours, that remarkable flowering of vernacular poetry and music, of a refined and sophisticated sensibility expressed in the Languedoc, was being systematically destroyed. Not because the Crusade targeted troubadours specifically, but because the social conditions that had produced and sustained that culture were being annihilated. The noble courts that had patronised the poets were being taken over by northern lords who spoke a different language and valued different things. The towns that had been the centres of a cosmopolitan, outward-looking civilization were being brought under a form of political control that had very different priorities. The language itself, the Languedoc, the Occitan tongue, the medium in which the troubadours had created something genuinely new in European literature, would survive for centuries in spoken form, but never again achieve the cultural prestige and literary production of the pre-Crusade period. What was being destroyed at Bziers and Carcassonne and Minerve, and across the hundreds of smaller engagements of the Albigensian Crusade, was not only a heresy. It was a civilization. Simon de Montfort died on June 25, 1218, before the walls of Toulouse. He had returned to besiege the city that had repelled him 7 years earlier, and the city was still holding out with the same stubborn determination it had shown before. A stone thrown by a mangonel, a siege engine operated. The chronicle reports with what might be grim satisfaction on the part of the southern author, by women and girls inside the city, struck him on the head and killed him instantly. He died at the height of his power and in the middle of an unfinished war. He had conquered most of the Trencavel territories. He had broken the military power of the old southern nobility. He had installed northern lords across much of Languedoc. He had not, however, taken Toulouse. He had not completed the conquest. He had not done what would have been necessary to make his gains permanent and irreversible. His son Amaury inherited his father's claims and his father's wars, without his father's genius for making wars go his way. The years after Simon's death saw a significant recovery by the southern forces. Raymond VI had died and been succeeded by his son Raymond VII, a more capable military commander who led a genuine resurgence of southern resistance. Amaury de Montfort found himself losing ground, losing castles, losing men, losing the accumulated military advantage his father had spent nearly a decade building. By 1224, Amaury had effectively given up. He formally ceded his claims to the French crown, to the King of France, Louis VIII, and departed the south. The Crusade, as a military enterprise led by Simon de Montfort and his family, was over. But what replaced it was, in some ways, more efficient and more thorough in its destruction than anything Simon had accomplished with cavalry and siege engines. What replaced it was the French crown, and after the French crown came the treaty, and after the treaty came the Inquisition. The Treaty of Paris in 1229, sometimes called the Treaty of Mauparis, after the two cities where it was negotiated and signed, formally ended the Albigensian Crusade as an open military conflict. Raymond VII of Toulouse, who had fought the resurgence of southern resistance with genuine ability, found himself in the end unable to resist the full military and political weight of the French monarchy, which was considerably more formidable than the baronial crusade he had been managing to hold off. The terms of the treaty were designed to accomplish what the military crusade had partially achieved: the permanent integration of Languedoc into the political orbit of the French crown, and the permanent suppression of the conditions that had allowed Catharism to flourish. Raymond VII retained his title but surrendered significant territories. His daughter was to marry a brother of the French king, ensuring that at Raymond's death the county of Toulouse would pass to the French royal family. He agreed to pay enormous financial reparations to the church and to the crusaders who had fought against him. He agreed to hunt down and surrender heretics. He agreed to demolish the walls of 30 specified towns and fortifications, removing the physical infrastructure of southern military resistance. He agreed to fund the establishment of a university at Toulouse, an institution that would, among other things, train Orthodox Catholic clergy to combat heresy in the region. And he agreed to cooperate with what the treaty called the searching out of heretics in his territories, with the Inquisition. The Church, looking at the results of 20 years of military crusade, had drawn a conclusion. You could destroy the political protection that heresy depended on. You could burn the castles and expel the lords and install northern nobles who had no interest in sheltering perfecti. But if the faith itself, the belief, the practice, the community of ordinary believers who kept the perfecti fed and housed and hidden, survived in the hearts and homes of the population, the heresy would survive too. You could not bomb your way to orthodoxy. You needed something more precise, something that could reach into the private lives and private beliefs of individual people and root out what was hidden there. You needed, in short, an institution specifically designed for that purpose. An institution with legal authority to interrogate, to compel testimony, to use the tools of judicial process to accomplish what military force could not. The Cathars had survived the fire and the sword. They were scattered, diminished, driven underground, but they were alive. In the mountains and the remote valleys, in the hidden rooms of sympathetic houses, in the memories and the prayers and the persistent faith of believers who had watched everything burn and still could not bring themselves to let go of what they believed, the faith persisted. But the instrument that would finally extinguish it was already being prepared. It had a name, and in the coming years that name would become the most feared word in the vocabulary of Languedoc. The Inquisition was coming. And unlike the crusading army, visible, violent, something you could see approaching from a distance and potentially flee, this new weapon would be invisible until it was already inside your house, already asking its questions, already writing down your answers in the careful, methodical records that would follow you and everyone you had ever named for the rest of your life. The fire and the sword had done their work. Now came something quieter, something patient, something, in its own terrible way, far more thorough. There is a particular kind of fear that comes not from the thing that is loud and visible and approaching across an open field, but from the thing that is quiet, the thing that sits across a table from you in a room with no windows and asks you, in a calm and reasonable voice, to tell it everything you know. The crusading army had been terrible. It had burned cities and mutilated prisoners and driven populations from their homes in their shirts. But it had also been something you could see coming. Something you could potentially flee from, hide from, outlast. The mountains of the Pyrenees had sheltered refugees. The remote valleys of the Corbières had swallowed whole communities of perfecti, who simply walked away from the war zone and found places where the army's reach did not extend. What arrived in Languedoc in the 1230s could not be fled from in the same way. It did not move across the landscape in a column of armed men. It arrived in ones and twos, Dominican friars mostly, trained in theology and in the careful arts of legal process, carrying the authority of the papacy and the mandate to ask questions, to write down answers, to compare what one person said with what another person had said in a different room on a different day and find the contradictions, to be patient in a way that armies cannot afford to be patient. To wait. The Inquisition, the formal institution of the medieval Inquisition, as distinct from the various ad hoc efforts to combat heresy that had preceded it, was not invented for Languedoc, but Languedoc was where it was first systematically deployed, and the techniques developed there would shape the institution for centuries. Pope Gregory IX, who had succeeded Innocent III after the intervening pontificates of Honorius III, formally established the Papal Inquisition in 1231, entrusting its operation primarily to the Dominican order, the order founded by that same Dominic who had walked barefoot through Languedoc 2 decades earlier, trying and failing to debate the Cathars out of their faith. The Dominicans were chosen because they were trained theologians, because their commitment to poverty and learning gave them a certain credibility that the secular clergy lacked, and because their founder had spent years in the south, and the order therefore had some knowledge of the terrain, physical and theological, they were being asked to navigate. The first inquisitors arrived in Languedoc in 1233. Their names were Guillaume Arnaud and Pierre Saylor. They were Dominican friars. They were not soldiers. They carried no weapons. And they were, in the long run, more effective at destroying Catharism than 20 years of military crusade had been. To understand how the Inquisition worked, how it actually functioned in the villages and towns of Languedoc, at the level of individual human beings sitting in rooms and answering questions, you need to understand its legal framework. Because the power of the Inquisition was not primarily the power of violence, though violence was available to it as a last resort and was used. Its primary power was the power of law, of record, of the written word in a world where most people could not read and had no idea what was being written about them. When inquisitors arrived in a town, they would typically begin with what was called a time of grace, a period, usually a few weeks, during which anyone who had been involved in heresy could come forward voluntarily, confess, and receive a relatively lenient penance. This was not mere mercy, it was strategy. The voluntary confessions gathered during the time of grace provided the inquisitors with names, with networks, with the beginnings of a map of who in this community knew whom, who had sheltered which perfectus, who had received the consolamentum, who had attended which clandestine meeting, in which house on which night. Every name given led to more names. Every confession was compared against previous confessions. The inquisitors built over time an extraordinarily detailed picture of the Cathar community in any given area, not just who was currently active, but who had been active years or even decades ago, because the Inquisition's records did not expire. A confession made in 1235 could be used to prosecute someone in 1245. The testimony of a dead witness recorded in the inquisitorial registers could be cited against the living. This record-keeping, meticulous, systematic, filed and cross-referenced in ways that had no precedent in medieval legal practice, was one of the Inquisition's most distinctive and most terrifying features. The registers of the Languedoc Inquisition, some of which survive today, are extraordinary documents. They contain the names of tens of thousands of people, their testimonies, the names they gave, the penances assigned to them. They are, among other things, the most detailed record we have of what Catharism actually looked like at the level of ordinary life, because the questions the inquisitors asked and the answers they recorded preserve details of daily Cathar practice that no Cathar document would ever have thought to note. We know, from these registers, the names of specific perfecti who passed through specific villages on specific nights. We know which households gave them food and shelter. We know who performed the melioramentum, the formal bow of respect that believers made to perfecti, when they encountered them. We know which farmers received the consolamentum on their deathbeds, and which ones recovered afterward, and faced the dilemma of whether to maintain the perfect life or undergo a spiritual fall. We know the texture of the faith as it was actually lived, in all its human complexity and compromise and courage and fear. We know these things because the Inquisition wrote them down, with names attached. The experience of being summoned before the Inquisition was designed, at every level, to be disorienting and to maximize the psychological pressure toward confession and denunciation. You were summoned alone. You were not told in advance what specific charges or suspicions you faced. You were sworn to tell the truth, and here the Cathar prohibition on oath swearing immediately created a problem, since refusing to swear was itself taken as evidence of heresy. You were asked to recite the Lord's Prayer and the Creed, standard tests, since the Cathar version of the Lord's Prayer differed from the Catholic one in ways a trained inquisitor would notice immediately. Then the questions began. Had you ever seen a perfectus? Had you ever made the melioramentum? Had you ever been present at a consolamentum? Had you ever eaten at the same table as a perfectus? Had you ever given food or money or shelter to a perfectus? Did you know anyone who had done these things? The questions were asked patiently, repeatedly, with variations. If you denied everything, the inquisitor would note specific names and dates drawn from previous testimonies, not necessarily revealing the source, just demonstrating knowledge, and ask you again. If you admitted something, the next question was always about who else was involved. The inquisitors understood human psychology in a practical, unsentimental way. They knew that most people, when faced with the choice between protecting others and protecting themselves in a situation where the evidence against them was already substantial, would eventually begin to talk. They knew that fear, sustained over time in the claustrophobic environment of an inquisitorial proceeding, wore down resistance more effectively than dramatic coercion. They were patient. They had time. The person sitting across the table from them, in most cases, had a family, had children, had fields that needed tending, and a life that needed to be returned to. Torture was available to the Inquisition, formally authorized by Pope Innocent IV in 1252, and was used. But it was used less frequently than popular imagination suggests, partly because the inquisitors had found that psychological pressure, skillfully applied over time, was often more productive than physical coercion, which could produce confessions that were too obviously coerced to be credible, and which generated resentment rather than the cooperative testimony that was actually useful. What you confessed to mattered enormously. If you admitted to heretical belief or practice and sincerely recanted, you received a penance, which might range from wearing yellow crosses sewn onto your clothing for the rest of your life, marking you publicly as a former heretic, to pilgrimage to specified shrines, to flogging, to imprisonment in various degrees of severity. If you were found guilty of heresy but refused to recant, if you insisted on maintaining your beliefs, you were handed over to the secular authorities for burning. The Church did not, technically, execute anyone. It handed the condemned to the secular arm. The secular arm did the burning. This legal distinction, paper-thin, observed by everyone to be paper-thin, but carefully maintained, absolved the Church of direct responsibility for the killing. If you confessed and recanted but were subsequently found to have relapsed into heresy, to have returned to Cathar practice after your recantation, there was no second chance. Relapsed heretics were burned automatically. This meant that anyone who had confessed and received penance lived for the rest of their life with the knowledge that a single subsequent denunciation could send them to the fire without further process. It was, as a system of social control, horribly effective. The Cathar community responded to the Inquisition with the resources available to it, which were diminishing but not yet exhausted. The network of believer households that had sustained the perfecti through the military crusade now became a clandestine underground, operating in secret rather than in the open but still functioning. Perfecti moved at night, stayed in hidden rooms, were sheltered by families who had learned to be careful about who they told and what they said. The consolamentum, the central sacrament, the deathbed rite that believers had always sought, continued to be administered, but now in greater secrecy, in rooms with closed shutters, with fewer witnesses. The mountains helped. The county of Farc, in the foothills of the Pyrenees, remained a significant centre of Cathar survival well into the middle of the 13th century. The Count of Foy and his family had been among the most committed supporters of Catharism among the southern nobility, and even after the military crusade had broken the power of most of the southern lords, the terrain of the Pyrenean foothills provided a measure of protection that the open plains of lower Languedoc could not offer. And there were people, ordinary people, farmers and artisans and minor nobles, who maintained the faith not out of fanaticism or desperation, but out of genuine conviction, who had grown up in Cathar households, who had watched perfecti heal the sick and comfort the dying, who had received the faith as something real and true and worth protecting, and who did not stop believing it simply because an army had come and gone, and now a different kind of threat sat in a room in town and wrote down names. These people are in many ways the most remarkable figures in the entire story. Not the perfecti, whose extraordinary courage and discipline have a certain heroic quality that makes them easy to admire from a distance, but the ordinary believers, the farmers and their wives and their children, who maintained a dangerous faith in the face of a systematic institutional effort to extinguish it, who sheltered perfecti at risk to their own lives and freedom, who lied to inquisitors when they had to, and told the truth to each other when they could, who kept something alive for decades after everyone with power had decided it needed to die. We know their names. The inquisitorial registers preserved them. And reading those registers, reading the testimony of a farmer explaining that yes, he had seen a perfectus in his barn 12 years ago, that his mother had received the consolamentum on her deathbed, that his neighbour had been present. And here is the neighbour's name, you feel, underneath the legal formality of the record, the full weight of what ordinary human beings were being asked to bear. Among the most remarkable documents of the entire Cathar story is the register of the Inquisitor Jacques Fournier, who conducted an intensive investigation of the village of Montaillou in the Pyrenean foothills between 1318 and 1325. Fournier, who would later become Pope Benedict Xi, was a meticulous and penetrating inquisitor, and the register he compiled of his interrogations of the villagers of Montaillou is one of the most extraordinary windows into medieval peasant life that has ever survived. The historian Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie turned the Fournier register into a celebrated book in the 1970s, and it is worth dwelling on what that register reveals, because by the time Fournier was conducting his investigations, we are a full century after the military crusade, nearly a century after the formal establishment of the Inquisition, and Catharism in Montaillou was still alive, diminished, battered, driven into corners, deprived of most of its institutional structure, but alive. The people of Montaillou were still receiving perfecti into their homes, still making the melioramentum, still seeking the consolamentum for their dying, still telling each other the stories and the theology of a faith that had survived persecution for a century and showed no particular inclination to stop surviving. The Fournier register is full of extraordinary human detail. Villagers describe specific conversations they had decades earlier, specific nights when a perfecta stayed in their house, specific words exchanged at bedsides and in fields, and at the edges of village fountains. They describe their beliefs with a frankness that sometimes seems almost suicidal, perhaps because, by that point, after a century of inquisition, the art of concealment had become so second nature that dropping it felt like relief, or perhaps because Fournier was simply a very skilled interrogator who knew how to create the conditions in which people said more than they intended. What emerges from the register is not the portrait of a fanatical underground movement sustained by ideological zeal. What emerges is a portrait of a community, complicated, gossipy, full of personal rivalries and romantic entanglements and the ordinary frictions of village life, for whom the Cathar faith was simply part of the texture of existence. People believed it the way people believe things they have grown up with, things their grandmothers taught them, things that have been woven into the fabric of family and community for longer than anyone can remember. This is what made it so difficult to eradicate, and this is what made the final eradication, when it came, so complete and so permanent. Because you cannot kill an idea by burning the people who hold it, not unless you burn enough of them and track down the rest, and pursue the survivors' children, and wait long enough for the living memory of the faith to simply run out. The fall of Montsker in 1244 is the moment that history has most consistently identified as the effective end of organised Catharism in Languedoc. It did not end the faith immediately. As Montaigu demonstrates, individual Cathar communities persisted for another century, but it broke something essential, something that could not be repaired. Montsker was a castle, not an especially large one, not especially impressive by the standards of the major fortifications of the region. It sat on a high rocky peak, a pog, in the local terminology, in the foothills of the Pyrenees, rising sharply from the surrounding landscape in a way that made it almost impossible to approach without being seen and extremely difficult to assault. It had become, in the years after the military crusade, something more than a castle. It had become a refuge. A gathering point, a place where perfecti from across Languedoc had come to live in relative safety, sheltered by the difficult terrain and the protection of the local lord, Raymond de Priel, who had rebuilt the castle in the 1200s specifically as a place where the Cathar community could survive. By the 1240s, Montsker housed a substantial community of perfecti, perhaps 200 or more, along with their families, servants, and the garrison of soldiers who defended the castle. It was, in the diminished and desperate landscape of post-Crusade Languedoc, the closest thing to a Cathar capital that still existed. In 1242, a group of men from Montsker's garrison, soldiers, not perfecti, rode down from the mountain and massacred a group of inquisitors at the village of Avignonet. The inquisitors, including Guillaume Arnaud, one of the first two inquisitors to have been deployed in Languedoc a decade earlier, were killed in the night, their bodies left where they fell. This was not strategically a wise act. It was an act of rage and desperation, the pent-up fury of people who had watched the Inquisition dismantle their community for a decade, expressed in the most direct and irreversible way possible. And it gave the French crown and the papacy exactly the justification they needed to do what they had been moving toward doing for years. The siege of Montsker began in May of 1243. The siege lasted 10 months. 10 months of the castle's community perched on their impossible rock, looking down at the army gathered below, knowing with increasing certainty what the outcome was going to be, but unable to find a way to avoid it. Occasional skirmishes, occasional attempts by outside Cathar sympathizers to bring in supplies or reinforcements, occasional exchanges of prisoners, a Christmas truce during which, the chronicles record, the people of the castle celebrated the Cathar ritual of the Bema feast in the cold mountain air. The garrison was not large enough to break out. the besieging army was not quite able to take the mountain by force. But the mathematics of the situation were inexorable. The castle could not be resupplied indefinitely. The army below was not going anywhere. Winter in the mountains was brutal, but spring would come, and with spring would come fresh troops and the renewed energy of an army that had been slowly tightening its grip for the better part of a year. In the late winter of 1244, the besiegers managed to seize a position on a spur of rock adjacent to the castle, a dangerous and difficult manoeuvre that brought their siege engines within range of the castle walls for the first time. The military situation became suddenly, decisively untenable. Raymond de Prael and the garrison commander negotiated terms of surrender. The terms, in the context of everything that had happened in Languedoc over the previous 4 decades, were relatively moderate. The soldiers who had participated in the Avignonet massacre would be handed over for punishment. Everyone else who abjured heresy would receive penances proportionate to their involvement. The castle would be surrendered on March 16, 1244. There was one provision that the negotiators specifically requested, and that the besieging commanders agreed to, a 2-week truce before the final surrender, during which the people of the castle would be left in peace on their mountain. No explanation was given for this request, and none was asked for. The truce was granted. We do not know with certainty what happened during those 2 weeks. The chroniclers were outside the castle. But what we know is what happened at the end of them. During the 2-week truce, somewhere between 20 and 25 people inside Montsker, who had not previously been perfecti, received the consolamentum. They chose, knowing exactly what they were choosing, to become perfect, to take on the full spiritual commitment of the Cathar faith, at the moment when being perfect meant walking into a fire. Think about that for a moment. Let it settle. These were not people who had spent their lives as perfecti, who had built their entire existence around the austere disciplines of the perfect life and could not now abandon them. These were ordinary believers, soldiers, probably, men and women who had lived normal lives inside the castle through the long siege, who chose, in the final 2 weeks of their freedom, to die as perfecti rather than live as something else. On March 16, 1244, the castle surrendered. The people who had abjured heresy, the soldiers and servants and family members who were willing to recant, were processed by the inquisitors present and assigned their penances. They came down the mountain. The perfecti did not recant. More than 200 of them, the accounts vary, but the number was substantial, were brought down from the castle. A large pyre had been constructed at the base of the mountain, in a field that local people still call the Field of the Burned. The perfecti were driven into it. The contemporary accounts say they walked without resistance. Some accounts say they sang. Whether or not they sang, and it is the kind of detail that might be embellished in the retelling, the core fact is attested by multiple sources. They did not fight. They did not try to flee. They walked into the fire. More than 200 people. Singing, or not singing, walking, but the story of Montsker has one more chapter, and it is one of the most tantalizing mysteries of the entire Cathar story. On the night before the final surrender, possibly the night of March 15th, while the truce was still in effect, 4 men were lowered from the walls of the castle on ropes. They climbed down the steep face of the Pog in the darkness, carrying something. They disappeared into the night. Who they were and what they carried has been the subject of speculation for 8 centuries. The contemporary sources mention the escape, but are vague about the details. Deliberately vague, perhaps, in the sources sympathetic to the Cathar community. Later accounts, embellished over time, claim they were carrying the Cathar treasure, gold or sacred texts, or some object of profound spiritual significance. Historians are sceptical of the more romantic versions of this story. The Perfecti owned almost nothing. The Cathar faith placed no value on material treasure. If there were texts of importance, and the Cathars did have texts, gospels and ritual manuals and theological treatises, they would have been worth preserving. Some Cathar manuscripts did survive and are in libraries today. What seems most likely, on the careful historical reading, is that the four men were carrying something of practical value to the continued survival of the Cathar community. Perhaps money, perhaps documents, perhaps simply themselves, as perfecti who could continue the ministry elsewhere. They went to Italy, possibly, where Cathar communities still existed. They went somewhere. The mountains swallowed them, and the records did not follow. It is, as mysteries go, a deeply human one. Four men on ropes in the dark, carrying whatever could be saved, going wherever survival was still possible. It is impossible not to feel something for them. The decades after Monsker were the long, slow dying of a faith. The Inquisition continued its work. The Perfecti who remained in Languedoc became fewer and more isolated, their networks increasingly disrupted, their ability to move through the landscape increasingly constrained by the watching and the recording, and the patient accumulation of information that was the Inquisition's primary weapon. The last significant Cathar revival, the one that Fournier's register at Montaigu documents so vividly, was centred on a single remarkable perfectus named Guillaume Blibast. Blibast was not, by any account, a particularly impressive man. He was flawed in ways that the Cathar perfecti were not supposed to be flawed. He had fathered a child, which was a significant violation of the perfect discipline. And his theology was not always reliable. But he was, in the early 14th century, the last functioning perfectus in Languedoc. Possibly the last in the world. He had been living in exile in Catalonia, on the Aragonese side of the Pyrenees, ministering to a small community of Cathar refugees who had followed him there. He was betrayed. A man named Arnaud Sicret, whose mother had been a Cathar and had died in poverty, her property confiscated by the Inquisition, and who had decided that the way to recover his family's fortunes was to become an informer, spent several years cultivating Blibast's trust. He pretended to be a sincere Cathar believer. He attended meetings. He received Blibast's ministry. He reported everything to the Inquisition. In 1321, Blibast was lured across the border into Catalonia under false pretences, arrested and handed to the Bishop of Pamiers, who was at that moment Jacques Fournier, the same man who was conducting the Montaigu investigations. Blibast was tried, convicted, and burned at the stake in the castle of Villarouge-Termens in the autumn of 1321. He was, as far as anyone knows, the last Cathar perfectus. With his death, the living chain of the Consolamentum was broken. There was no one left who could administer the central sacrament of the faith. There might be believers, people who still held Cathar beliefs in their hearts, who still understood themselves as members of a Cathar community, but there were no more perfecti to console them, no more administrators of the sacrament that was the mechanism of the faith's spiritual promise. The faith could not survive that break. Whatever remained in Montaigu and the other villages of the Pyrenean foothills in the years after Blibast's death was memory, not practice. And memory, without the structures to sustain and transmit it, fades by the middle of the 14th century, helped along, in a grim historical irony, by the Black Death, which devastated the already diminished Cathar communities along with everyone else. Catharism in Languedoc was effectively extinct. What had been lost? This is the question that the story of the Cathars ultimately forces us to sit with, not simply as an accounting of suffering, though the suffering was real and enormous, and deserves to be named and felt, but as a question about what the world looks like when a living thing is removed from it. The Cathar faith itself, the theology, the practice, the community was gone. Whatever one thinks of dualist theology, whatever one makes of the Cathar account of creation and the soul and the material world, it was a genuine attempt by human beings to make sense of existence, to answer the hardest questions, to live in accordance with what they believed was true. It had produced people of extraordinary spiritual seriousness and courage. It had produced communities of genuine mutual care. It had, for a century or more, given meaning to the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. That was gone. The troubadour culture was gone, or so diminished as to be barely recognisable. The Languedoc, the Occitan language in which that culture had been expressed, survived in spoken form but lost its literary prestige, its status as a vehicle for serious creative work. The great tradition of vernacular poetry that the troubadours had pioneered, that had influenced Dante and Petrarch and through them the entire trajectory of European literature, was cut off at the root. The distinctive civilization of Languedoc, its cosmopolitanism, its relative tolerance, its integration of Jewish and Muslim and Christian intellectual traditions, its particular political culture in which the relationship between lords and subjects was somewhat less brutally hierarchical than in the north, was absorbed into the expanding French kingdom and gradually, over generations, lost its distinctiveness. The Jewish communities of the south, which had thrived in the relatively tolerant environment of pre-Crusade Languedoc, found themselves increasingly exposed as that tolerance was replaced by the norms of northern French Catholic culture. The expulsion of the Jews from France in 1306 ended communities that had existed in the south for centuries, and the land itself, the vineyards and the olive groves and the warm limestone hills of what we now call the Languedoc wine region, retained its physical beauty while losing the human civilization that had, for a brief and remarkable period, made it one of the most intellectually and culturally alive places in medieval Europe. What the Crusade and the Inquisition between them accomplished was something that historians have argued about ever since. Was it primarily a religious persecution, a genuine if appalling effort by the medieval church to protect what it believed was the eternal salvation of Christian souls? Was it primarily a political and economic enterprise, a land grab by the northern French nobility and the French crown, using the convenient cover of religious orthodoxy? Was it a cultural genocide, a deliberate destruction of a distinct civilization that happened to be expressed in religious terms? The honest answer is that it was all of these things simultaneously, in proportions that varied depending on which actors you were looking at, and at which moment in the long arc of the conflict. Pope Innocent III genuinely believed he was fighting for the soul of Christendom. Simon de Montfort genuinely believed he was doing God's work and also wanted land. The northern barons who answered the Crusade call were moved by a mixture of piety and opportunism in varying proportions. The inquisitors who spent their careers in the patient, meticulous destruction of Cathar networks were, for the most part, sincere men who believed they were saving souls from damnation, even as the methods they used destroyed lives. This complexity does not reduce the horror. If anything, it deepens it. Because the destruction of the Cathar world was not the work of monsters, not primarily, not mainly. It was the work of ordinary human beings, many of them sincere, many of them intelligent, many of them in their own ways admirable, who had decided that the elimination of a difference they could not tolerate was worth whatever it cost. That is, historically speaking, a more disturbing conclusion than the one in which the villains are simply villains. The Cathar story did not entirely disappear from human memory, even during the centuries when it was most thoroughly suppressed. The inquisitorial records survived, locked in ecclesiastical archives. The ruins of the castles where the last perfecti had made their stands remained on their hilltops, Monsker most famously, but also Curibus and Peripertus and dozens of others, the so-called Cathar castles, weathering slowly in the southern sun. In the 19th century, with the growth of Romantic nationalism and the scholarly recovery of medieval history, the Cathars began to be rediscovered. Occitan regionalists, looking for a pre-French identity for the south, found in the Cathars a usable symbol, a people who had been different, who had resisted assimilation, who had been destroyed for their difference. The story of the troubadours and the perfecti and the burned civilization of Languedoc became part of a regional mythology of loss and resistance. In the 20th century, the Cathars attracted a different kind of attention from esotericists and conspiracy theorists and alternative historians, who loaded them with meanings they almost certainly never had. The Cathar treasure allegedly smuggled out of Monsker became connected to the Holy Grail, to the Ark of the Covenant, to the secrets of Rennes-le-Château, to a cascade of increasingly elaborate theories that had very little to do with the actual historical Cathars, and everything to do with the particular needs and fantasies of modern people searching for hidden truths. The real Cathars, the people who actually lived, who actually believed, who actually walked into fires singing or not singing on a cold March morning in 1244, are more interesting than any of these projections, more human, more complicated, more worth knowing. They were not perfect, despite the name their spiritual elite carried. Their theology, on close examination, contains plenty of internal tensions and unresolved difficulties. Their communities, as the Fournier Register makes clear, were full of the ordinary human failures that communities have always been full of: jealousy, gossip, betrayal, self-interest dressed up as principle. The perfecti themselves, for all their genuine courage and discipline, lived in a theological system that had a complicated relationship with the body, with sexuality, with the material world in all its ordinary richness, a relationship that many modern people would find troubling. But they were also people who asked real questions about suffering and evil and the nature of God, and who refused to accept answers they found unconvincing simply because the unconvincing answers were backed by institutional power. They were people who built communities of genuine mutual care and maintained them under conditions of extraordinary difficulty. They were people who died, many of them, over and over again in fire after fire across a century of persecution, rather than pretend to believe something they did not believe. There is something in that worth remembering, something worth honouring even across 8 centuries, something that the very thoroughness of the attempt to erase them has not quite managed to erase. And so the story ends. Not with a battle or a treaty or a final fire, but with a slow fading, the last perfectus burning at Villarouge-Termens in 1321, the last believers in their Pyrenean villages growing old and dying without anyone to console them, the registers closing, the Languedoc retreating into the rhythms of rural speech, the castles emptying on their hilltops. What was done to the Cathars was not defensible. Whatever one thinks of their theology, whatever legitimate concerns the medieval church had about the challenge they represented, the answer was not this. The answer was not Zias. The answer was not the mutilated men walking to Carcassonne with their empty eye sockets. The answer was not 200 people driven into a field of fire on a March morning in the mountains. The answer was not Jacques Fournier's patient, meticulous dismantling of a village community, name by name, confession by confession, across years of careful destruction. History is full of things that were not defensible. That is, perhaps, one of the most important things history teaches us. Not the comfortable lesson that the good tend to triumph, but the uncomfortable one that they do not always, and that the forces capable of destroying something beautiful are often more organised and more ruthless and more patient than the beautiful thing itself. The Cathars built something remarkable in the warm hills of medieval Languedoc, something that was, in important ways, ahead of its time, more egalitarian, more spiritually serious, more genuinely lived than the official faith it challenged. And it was destroyed. Comprehensively, permanently, by an institution that found its existence intolerable and had the power to act on that intolerance. We remember it tonight because forgetting it would be, in its own small way, a continuation of the erasure. Because the people who walked into the fire at Montsker deserve to be known. Because the farmers of Montaillou who kept a dangerous faith alive for a century in the face of everything deserve to be known. Because Guillaume Blibast, the last and flawed and very human last perfectus, deserves to be known. Because knowing them, really knowing them, in all their complexity and courage and ordinary humanness, is the only kind of resurrection that history can offer. And so, here we are, at the end of tonight's journey. Are you still awake? If you are, I hope you have found something in this story worth carrying with you, not into sleep necessarily, but into the days that follow. The Cathars are not a simple story with a simple lesson. They resist that. They are a story about belief and power and the terrible things that happen when one meets the other without mercy. They are a story about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, doing what they could with what they had. They are a story about a world that was destroyed and the ghost it left behind. If tonight's journey moved you in some way, or made you think, or simply carried you gently through the hours, it would mean a great deal if you left a comment below. Tell me what struck you. Tell me what surprised you. Tell me where you are and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you enjoyed what we did here tonight on Just About History, if this is the kind of storytelling you want more of, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It is the single most important thing you can do to help these stories find their way to the people who need them. History is full of voices that were silenced. Every subscriber is a small act of ensuring that the ones we recover are heard a little more widely. Now put down whatever is left of tonight. Let your thoughts settle. Let the Cathars and their warm hills and their impossible courage drift gently into the background of your sleep. You have done good, staying with this story to the end, and we will see you next time.